Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Before starting on to the video, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel Asterisk. The prairie stretched wide and endless, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the little graveyard on the edge of Willow Creek. Clara Dawson stood alone before a mound of fresh earth, her shawl drawn tight around her thin frame, her newborn son cradled close against her breast. The baby Thomas whimpered softly, his tiny voice breaking into the silence of the place. Clara's eyes were swollen from nights of weeping, and yet the tears still found their way down her cheeks. Beneath the soil lay her husband, Samuel Dawson, struck down too young by a fall from a horse. He had been her protector, her love, the man she believed she would grow old beside. Now she faced the world with only a child in her arms and the crushing weight of widowhood pressing down on her shoulders. She whispered to the grave, words carried away by the prairie wind. "I don't know how to do this without you, Samuel, but I'll try for him." Her lips pressed against her baby's forehead, her heart breaking with each beat. She remembered Samuel's laughter, the promises he had made of a little cabin on a piece of land they would call their own, and the way he had once pressed her hand against her rounded belly and whispered, "No matter what, you and this child will always have me." But promises were fragile on the frontier, and his had been stolen in an instant. The creak of the graveyard gate broke her solitude. Clara turned, half hoping foolishly that it was Samuel, alive and smiling, coming to walk her home. Instead, it was Martha Dawson, her mother-in-law, her face hard as stone. Behind her came Henry Dawson, Samuel's younger brother, his smirk curling like smoke. Clara's heart sank. She knew that look in Martha's eyes, cold and merciless. "Clara," Martha said, her voice sharp enough to cut, "the service is over. You should leave now." Clara's brow furrowed, confusion warring with grief. "Leave? But this is my husband's grave." Martha corrected her with venom. "Our son's grave. You've no place with us anymore." The words struck harder than any physical blow. Clara's grip tightened on her baby as Henry stepped forward, arms folded, his tone dripping with disdain. "You should be grateful we let you stay as long as Samuel lived. But he's gone now, and so are you." Clara's throat burned with desperation. "I'm his wife," she said. "I'm the mother of his child." Martha's reply was cruel and final. "You're nothing without him. Another mouth to feed. And you'll not stain the Dawson name any longer." Clara's eyes filled, but she stood as tall as her trembling body allowed. "Samuel loved me. This child is his blood." Henry gave a dry laugh. "Then let the child keep you company elsewhere." Martha's hand sliced the air. "Leave by sundown, or we'll make sure you do." Clara's body shook as she turned back toward the grave one last time. Tears blurred the mound of dirt as she whispered, "Goodbye, Samuel. They're taking everything from us, but I'll keep him safe. I swear it." With her shawl fluttering in the rising wind, she walked away from the cemetery, carrying not only her baby, but the burden of an uncertain future. She had no money, no horse, no kin to turn to. Only the memory of Samuel's voice urging her to be strong. The road stretched long and empty beneath her weary feet. By the time she reached the edge of town, lanterns were being lit in windows and voices rose from the saloon. Clara stood outside the general store, staring through the glass at shelves of bread and beans. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but she had nothing to trade. People passed by, some casting pitying glances, others shaking their heads. "Poor thing," she heard a woman whisper, "thrown out already, with a babe in arms." Clara pulled her shawl tighter, lowering her head against the sting of shame. She found a bench beside the store and sat heavily, her body aching, her spirit close to breaking. Thomas stirred, fussing with hunger. With trembling hands, Clara shifted her shawl to nurse him, whispering, "I'll take care of you, Thomas, even if no one else wants us." The baby's small cries softened, and she rocked him gently, humming a lullaby through her tears. Around her, the town carried on as though her world had not collapsed. The sky above blazed crimson and gold before fading into the deep blue of night. Stars emerged, distant and cold, while the prairie wind whispered across the empty street. Clara lifted her gaze toward the horizon where darkness gathered. Somewhere out there, she knew, a new life waited. Somewhere she would have to find strength, a roof, a way to feed her child. But tonight, all she had was the shawl on her shoulders, the baby in her arms, and the fading warmth of her husband's love. "We'll survive," she murmured, though fear coiled in her chest. She pressed a kiss to Thomas's downy head and rocked him until his small breaths evened into sleep. Alone on that bench, she whispered one last prayer into the night air. "God help me. God help us both." And across the prairie, on a lonely ranch where a lantern still burned, a man named Jack Mercer stood on his porch, gazing at the same stars. He had no idea that fate was already drawing Clara Dawson, her newborn son, into his life. No idea that the silence of his ranch would soon be broken. For now, Clara sat alone in the shadows, cast out by family, clinging to her child, unaware that her fall was only the beginning of a story far greater than her sorrow. Jack Mercer's ranch sat a few miles beyond the edge of Willow Creek, a stretch of land that rolled out toward the horizon like a sea of grass. The house was plain but sturdy, built with his own hands years ago, its boards weathered by wind and sun. Jack had always been known as a man of quiet strength, one who minded his business and asked little of others. Folks in town respected him, even admired him, though they whispered that his solitude was both his pride and his prison. He had no wife, no children, and no kin nearby, just the cattle that grazed on his fields and the work that filled his days. For years, Jack had lived with a steady rhythm: rise before dawn, saddle his horse, mend fences, ride the herds, fix what was broken, return at dusk, and eat alone at his kitchen table while the crickets sang outside. It was a life of routine and silence, and he had grown used to it, though sometimes, on still nights, he would stare out at the stars and feel the weight of something missing. A warmth, a voice, perhaps laughter echoing in the halls that remained. Too quiet. But he never spoke of it, not even to himself. That evening, Jack rode into town to buy supplies. The general store was lit, its lamplight spilling onto the street, and the scent of fresh bread hung faintly in the air. He tied his horse, adjusted his hat, and stepped inside, nodding at the storekeeper. While gathering flour, coffee, and nails, Jack noticed the way the townsfolk were talking in low voices near the counter. He caught snippets. The Dawson widow, thrown out, a babe in arms. Jack didn't pay it much attention until he left the store, supplies in hand, and saw her. Clara sat on a bench just outside, her shawl wrapped tightly, her face pale and weary. In her arms, the newborn squirmed, his tiny fists waving in the air before settling back against his mother's chest. Jack paused in the doorway, his rough hand tightening on the sack of flour. He had seen sorrow before. Hardship was no stranger to the frontier, but the sight of this young woman with a babe, left so alone, struck something deep in him. Clara kept her gaze lowered, but when Thomas whimpered, she rocked him gently and murmured, "Mama's here." The tenderness in her voice, the strength it carried despite her exhaustion, made Jack's chest tighten. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the wooden planks. Clara looked up, startled. Their eyes met for the first time. Hers were red-rimmed from crying, but within them flickered a quiet determination. "You need some water?" Jack asked, his voice deep, steady, yet gentle. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but she saw no malice in his face. She nodded. Faintly. Jack set down his supplies, disappeared into the store, and returned with a dipper of cool water. Clara took it gratefully, sipping before tilting it carefully so she could touch it to the baby's lips. Jack watched silently, the edges of his heart softening at the sight. "You've got a little one," he said, though it was plain. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Thomas." Jack nodded once. Strong name. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sounds of wagons rattling past and voices drifting from the saloon down the street. Jack shifted his weight, unused to conversation but unwilling to walk away. He had seen pity in the eyes of others, but his own gaze held something different respect. He could see the fight in her, though she was weary to the bone. "Got somewhere." "To stay?" he asked finally. Claire's lips trembled. She looked down at her baby, then away, ashamed. "No, not anymore." The simplicity of her words carried the whole truth. The family that had cast her out, the world that had turned its back. Jack felt a slow anger rise in his chest at the thought of anyone throwing the woman and child to the wind. He cleared his throat. "There's a boarding house up the street," he said, pointing. "They'll give you a room for a bit." Clara shook her head, her voice barely audible. "I have nothing to pay them with." Jack studied her a moment, his jaw tightening. He had always believed in standing on his own 2 feet, never owing or asking, but here was someone who had been stripped of everything. He couldn't turn away. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a few coins and placed them on the bench beside her. Her eyes widened. "I can't." "You can," Jack interrupted gently. "It's not charity. It's just what's right." Clara's throat tightened, tears threatening again. She looked at him with gratitude shining through her exhaustion. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "Jack Mercer," she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I'll find a way to repay you." Jack tipped his hat, lifting his supplies. "No need. Just take care of the little one." He walked away, but his mind lingered on the image of her sitting there in the lamplight, holding her baby like the most precious treasure in the world, even when she had nothing else left. That night, back on his ranch, Jack set down his supper untouched. The loneliness of his house seemed heavier than usual. Out beyond his window, the prairie stretched into darkness, and he thought of the widow and her newborn somewhere in town. Clinging to each other against the cold dot, it was the first time in years that Jack Mercer prayed before bed. He didn't ask for much, only that Clara Dawson and her child would find a roof, some kindness, and a chance to begin again. Little did he know that his own life was about to change. That fate was weaving their paths together in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The storm rolled in fast from the western horizon, thick black clouds boiling up like angry smoke. By late afternoon the air was heavy, the prairie grass bending under sudden gusts of wind, and thunder growled low across the sky. Clara Dawson stood in the doorway of the small shack she had managed to rent with the few coins Jack Mercer had pressed into her hand. The boards of the place were thin, patched with gaps, and the roof sagged like a weary back. Still, she had whispered prayers of thanks when the landlady let her in. At least it was shelter for herself and her infant son. Now, as the first drops of rain spattered against the ground, Clara pressed Thomas tighter to her chest. The baby whimpered, sensitive to the shift in the air. "She, darling," she soothed, though her own heart trembled. She had known storms before, but there was something fierce and merciless about the frontier's wrath when the sky broke open. A few minutes later, the heavens did just that. Rain came in torrents, drumming against the roof so hard it seemed the boards would splinter. Wind howled through the cracks in the walls, snuffing out the small lamp Clara had lit. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the shack in ghostly flashes, followed by thunder that rattled the very ground. Clara huddled in the corner, her shawl wrapped around both herself and Thomas. She whispered prayers into the storm, begging God for safety, but safety was not in the cards. With a loud crack, part of the roof gave way. A rush of rain poured inside, soaking the dirt floor, splashing against Clara's skirts. She gasped, clutching her baby tighter, scrambling to the other side. The boards groaned, threatening more collapse. Thomas cried, his thin wails swallowed by the roar of the storm. Clara's eyes darted around desperately. She had nowhere else to go. No carriage, no horse, not even an umbrella. Just her bare feet, her baby, and the will to survive. She wrapped the shawl tighter, holding Thomas against her chest to shield him from the icy rain now seeping through every crack. The shack shook under the fury of the storm. Another section of roof tore loose, crashing to the floor. Clara let out a cry, stumbling backward. She couldn't stay not another moment. She had to get out, gathering her child in one arm, clutching a small bundle of belongings in the other. She shoved the door open against the gale. The wind almost tore it from her grip. Rain lashed her face, soaking her hair, chilling her to the bone. She staggered onto the muddy road, barefoot, the world around her a blur of water and wind. The storm shrieked like some wild beast, trying to swallow her whole. "Mama's here," she kept whispering, though her lips were blue, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Mama's here, Thomas. Hold on, sweetheart. Hold on." She stumbled forward, lightning illuminating her pale face, her determined eyes. Out on the prairie, Jack Mercer was returning from checking his fences. He had seen the storm brewing and hurried his horse home, but as he neared his ranch, he caught sight of a figure stumbling along the road. At first, he thought it must be some drifter caught in the weather. Then lightning revealed a young woman clutching something close to her chest. His heart dropped out. It was Clara Dawson. And in her arms, the child. Jack spurred his horse forward, splashing through mud until he reached her side. "Clara!" he shouted over the wind. She looked up, eyes wide with terror, soaked to the skin. "Mr. Mercer," she gasped. "The roof had collapsed. We had to run." Her voice broke as Thomas wailed. Jack swung down from his saddle without a second thought. "Give him here," he said firmly, but gently. Clara hesitated only a moment before letting him wrap the baby securely in his coat. Then he grabbed her arm. "Come on. My ranch is just ahead. You'll not survive this storm out here." Clara's legs gave out in the mud, but Jack caught her, lifting both mother and child into his arms as though they weighed nothing. He mounted the horse again, holding them tight against him. "Hold on," he growled, digging his heels into the horse's sides. The animal surged forward through the sheets of rain. Clara clung to Jack's chest, her baby pressed between them, while thunder boomed and lightning split the prairie sky. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the lights of Jack's ranch house came into view, glowing warm and steady against the chaos outside. He rode hard to the porch, swung down, and carried Clara and Thomas through the door, kicking it shut behind him. The storm's roar dulled, replaced by the crackle of a fire already burning in the hearth. Jack set Clara down gently in a chair, then peeled off his soaked coat to reveal the tiny bundle nestled within. Thomas whimpered, but he was safe, his small body warm against Jack's chest. Clara reached for him with trembling arms. Jack handed the baby back, then hurried to fetch blankets. He returned, draping one around Clara's shoulders, another around Thomas. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Clara's lips trembled. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "You don't have to explain," Jack said. He knelt by the fire, adding more logs. The flames leapt higher, filling the room with heat. "You and the boy'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure something else out." Clara lowered her gaze, clutching Thomas close. "I'll work for it," she said quickly. "I'll cook, clean, whatever needs doing. I don't want to be a burden." Jack looked at her, his face softened by firelight. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're a mother with a child. That's reason enough." The storm raged on outside, tearing across the plains, but within the walls of Jack Mercer's home there was warmth, shelter, and something Clara hadn't felt since Samuel's death: safety. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe, let herself believe she and her baby might survive after all. She rocked Thomas, humming softly, while Jack sat nearby, silent but steady. The kind of presence that made the world feel a less cruel. By morning, the storm would pass, but Clara Dawson's life had already shifted. She had entered Jack Mercer's home with nothing but fear and desperation, yet in the glow of the firelight, something new was born, the faint, fragile beginning of trust. The weeks that followed were a gentle unfolding of something Sarah never thought she would feel again: security. The ranch that had once seemed so vast and strange to her began to feel like home. Every corner carried the smell of wood leather and earth, mingled with the sweetness of her newborn's laughter. Ethan kept his word. The land was truly hers now, yet he never pulled away. Instead, he lingered at the edges of her days, offering help where it was needed, and silence when words might break something delicate between them. Sarah would rise before dawn, her baby bundled against the chill, and step outside to see Ethan. Already tending to the horses, his strong frame lit by the faint glow of morning. There was something unspoken in the way he tipped his hat to her, a recognition that warmed her more than any fire could. Sarah's heart still carried grief, but it was shifting. Grief no longer consumed her, but lived alongside a new awareness. Ethan had never asked for thanks, but she found herself wanting to give it in small ways. She made meals that reminded her of her mother's kitchen, bringing him stew after long days, leaving biscuits on the porch. Each time, Ethan's eyes softened, though his words remained spare. One evening, while the baby slept, Sarah lingered by the corral fence as Ethan worked with a restless Mare. The horse reared, but Ethan's voice, steady, low, and patient, calmed it back down. Sarah felt something stir deep inside her, not just admiration but recognition. Here was a man who carried storms inside him, yet chose gentleness when he could have chosen force. Their conversations grew longer in those quiet twilight hours. At first, they spoke of the ranch fencing, water rights, and cattle. But slowly, other pieces slipped in. Ethan told her about losing his parents young, how the land had been both his burden and his salvation. Sarah shared little fragments of her own story, the childhood dreams she once had of painting landscapes, dreams smothered by duty and marriage. Ethan listened, truly listened, in a way that made her feel seen. The silence between them was no longer empty but filled with possibility. Still, Sarah battled fear. She had trusted once before and been left with nothing. Her late husband's family had reminded her cruelly how fragile security was. Could she allow herself to lean on Ethan? Or worse, what if he leaned on her and she failed him? Some nights she lay awake, her baby tucked close, staring at the ceiling beams while her heart waged war with itself. Yet every morning, when Ethan came to check the barn or split wood for her fire, the war eased a little. His steady presence was like the mountains in the distance, silent, unyielding, and strangely comforting. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, drenching the land in sheets of rain. Sarah rushed to secure the wash still hanging on the line, her hair plastered to her face. She struggled with the basket, nearly slipping in the mud when Ethan appeared beside her. He lifted the basket effortlessly, guiding her back inside with a protective hand at her elbow. They stood in the kitchen, both dripping, laughter breaking from Sarah's lips before she could stop it. It had been so long since she had laughed. like that free, unguarded. Ethan smiled, and in that rare moment, his usual reserve melted. For the first time, Sarah wondered what it would be like to reach across the silence and touch his hand, to anchor herself in the quiet strength he carried. The baby's cry interrupted them, breaking the fragile moment, yet the warmth lingered. Ethan excused himself, retreating into the storm, but Sarah felt her heart had crossed some unseen threshold. She was no longer merely surviving. She was beginning to imagine what it might mean to live again, not just for her child, but for herself, and so the whispers of a future began to stir in her heart, soft and uncertain, but persistent. She didn't dare name it yet, but she carried it like a fragile flame, hidden against the winds of doubt, waiting to see if it might grow. Clara awoke at dawn to the soft cries of her baby, the gentle hush of the wind brushing against the wooden walls of the ranch house. For the first time in weeks, she did not wake with panic clawing at her chest. Instead, she rose slowly, swaying, with the child in her arms, looking around at the place Samuel had given her. It was small, worn by weather and years of use, but it was hers. That truth alone filled her with something she had nearly forgotten existed: security. As she rocked her child back to sleep, her thoughts drifted to Samuel, the quiet rancher, whose kindness had changed the course of her life. He had asked for nothing in return, yet every day since, Clara found herself wanting to repay the generosity that had saved her. Perhaps not with words, but with hard work, determination, and a promise that she and her baby would make this land come alive again. Days stretched into weeks, and Clara worked tirelessly. At first, the weight of her sorrow dragged at her, memory of her late husband shadowing every corner of her heart. But the land, though harsh and demanding, gave her purpose. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, the tending of chickens, the mending of fences, the endless sweeping and scrubbing that made the house feel less like a stranger's cabin and more like a home. With each passing day, her hands grew calloused. Her back ached, but her spirit slowly mended. Samuel would visit from time to time, riding in with supplies or stopping by to check the condition of the cattle. His presence always came quietly, without intrusion, as though he understood she needed space to find her footing. Yet, Clara noticed how he lingered just long enough to make sure she wasn't overwhelmed, and how his calm words encouraged her. More than he likely realized. The townsfolk, however, were slower to change. Clara often felt their eyes on her when she ventured into town for flour or feed. Whispers trailed behind her in the general store, words sharp as thorns. "That's the widow Thompson," the one they cast out. Some pitied her, others judged her, but none offered friendship. Still, Clara held her chin high, walking with quiet pride, because she had a ranch to return to, land to work, and a child to raise. No gossip could take that from her. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in shades of fire and gold, she would sit on the porch with her baby in her arms, breathing in the scent of earth and cattle, watching the dust settle across the fields. In those quiet moments, she told herself again and again, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." One evening, as Samuel repaired the gate by her barn, Clara found herself bringing out a plate of cornbread she had baked. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down, uncertain if the gesture was too forward. Samuel looked at her with surprise, then gratitude, and for the first time she saw his lips curve into a faint smile. That small smile stirred something inside her chest, fragile and unfamiliar, yet warm. They ate in silence at first, but gradually, conversations began to form about the weather, the cattle, the stubbornness of the old mule. Simple words, yet each exchange chipped away at the wall of loneliness that had surrounded Clara since her husband's death. She found herself laughing quietly one evening at a dry remark Samuel made about the mule's refusal to work, and the sound startled her. It had been so long since she had laughed that it felt foreign, almost guilty. But Samuel looked at her with a softness in his eyes that told her it was all right to laugh again. Despite the comfort Samuel's presence brought, Clara faced struggles that tested her strength. The winter came early that year, harsh winds sweeping across the plains, rattling the windows of her small home. Firewood was scarce, and Clara had to learn to split logs on her own, blisters marking her hands where once rings had rested. She worried endlessly over her child, bundling the baby in quilts to keep him warm against the cold nights. Some days she felt her body might give way under the strain, her grief and exhaustion threatening to swallow her whole. Yet, when the baby smiled at her, or when Samuel quietly left a stack of firewood by her door without a word, she found the will to push forward. Hope, though fragile, had begun to grow roots in her heart. Taking hold in the soil of struggle. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Wildflowers bloomed across the fields, and Clara planted a small garden behind the house, determined to provide food for herself and her baby. Samuel taught her how to till the soil properly, his large hands guiding hers as he showed her deep to press the seeds. She noticed then the gentleness of his touch, so unlike the roughness his rancher's frame suggested. He never assumed control, never overshadowed her, but instead guided with patience and quiet respect. Their bond deepened in those moments, though neither spoke of it. Clara often caught herself watching him as he worked, the steady strength in his movements, the quiet steadiness that had become her anchor. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, Samuel's eyes lingered on her too, filled with something unspoken, something he seemed unwilling or perhaps afraid to name. Yet not all was peace. The Thompson family, the very ones who had cast Clara out, still lived in town, and word of her rebuilding life on Samuel's land began to reach them. One afternoon, as Clara walked through town with her baby, she was confronted by her late husband's brother. His voice was sharp, dripping with bitterness, as he accused her of bringing shame to their name, of being a burden on the charity of others. Clara's heart pounded, fear and humiliation threatening to unravel her composure. But then she thought of her baby, thought of the ranch that had become her sanctuary, and she stood tall. With steady eyes, she told him she no longer carried his family's name nor their cruelty. She belonged to no one but herself, her child, and the land she was making her own. The confrontation left her shaken, but also strangely free. She walked back to the ranch with her head high, no longer cowering under the shadow of the family who had betrayed her. That evening, Samuel found her sitting on the porch, tears glistening in her eyes as the baby slept in her arms. Without a word, he sat beside her, his presence solid and grounding. She told him what had happened, her voice trembling with the fear she had pushed down earlier. Samuel listened quietly, then said simply, "They don't see your strength, Clara, but I do." Those words, spoken in his low, steady tone, broke the dam inside her. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara allowed herself to cry openly, not the silent tears of despair, but the cleansing release of grief, fear, and hope mingled together. Samuel did not try to stop her, did not try to comfort her with empty words. He simply sat beside her, the quiet weight of his presence telling her she was not alone. And for Clara, that was enough. From that day forward, Clara's bond with Samuel grew stronger. They worked side by side on the ranch, weathering the trials of nature, enduring the whispers of townsfolk, and slowly building a life that, though fragile, felt real. Each sunrise brought new labor, each sunset brought quiet moments of shared peace. Clara began to see the ranch not just as a gift from Samuel, but as a promise, a foundation upon which she could build a future for her child, and perhaps in time, something more. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Clara no longer felt lost. She had land beneath her feet, a child in her arms, and a man beside her whose quiet strength had become her greatest solace. And in the stillness of the prairie nights as the stars stretched endless above her, Clara allowed herself to dream not of what she had lost, but of what she might yet find. The morning sun rose golden across the wide prairie, casting its warm glow upon the stretch of land that was no longer just soil and grass. It was promise. It was home. Clara stood near the edge of the field, her baby held close against her chest, while James McAllister, the rancher who had been her unlikely savior, rode slowly beside her on his tall sorrel horse. The air was alive with the scent of new earth, wildflowers opening their heads to the sky, and the faint sound of cattle lowing in the distance. For the first time in months, Clara felt the crushing weight of grief and fear lifting, like storm clouds finally drifting apart after a long, bitter night. She looked at the land her land now, because James had given it to her without demand, without condition, without expectation. The farmhouse, though small, was being repaired with care. A roof mended, windows cleaned, and a sturdy fence rising where broken posts once leaned. Local hands, men who respected James and trusted his word, had volunteered to help after hearing the widow's story. Clara felt her throat tighten every time she saw them nailing boards or carrying hay bales, not because she asked, but because kindness still existed in a world that had shown her so much cruelty. James dismounted, removing his hat, running a hand through his hair as he looked at the baby. "He's growing," he said softly, his voice carrying that steady calm she had come to rely on. "Looks like he's already got his daddy's stubborn jaw." Clara smiled faintly, though tears stung her eyes. She had thought the mention of her husband would break her heart all over again, but here on this land, with James's presence, she felt something different. She felt like her late husband's spirit wasn't tied to bitterness or loss, but to the soil and the new life blooming around her. Weeks passed, and with every dawn the ranch transformed. Clara planted a small garden behind the house, her hands in the earth as she whispered prayers for strength. James often worked nearby, fixing the corral or riding the fence line, yet he always stopped to check on her, sometimes bringing a bucket of water, sometimes just offering a quiet word. The unspoken bond between them deepened, not rushed, not forced, but steady as the turning of the seasons. The townsfolk noticed, of course. They whispered at the mercantile, wondering if the rancher had finally found his match in the widow who had suffered so much. But Clara ignored the whispers. She only cared about the peace she felt here, and the way James's steady presence soothed the scars left by betrayal. One evening, after a long day of work, James stood with her on the porch. The sky was ablaze with colors, pink, orange, violet, painting the world in hues of hope. Clara held her baby close, rocking him gently as he slept. James cleared his throat, his voice low but certain. "Clara, this land was yours the moment you stepped on it. Not because I gave it, but because you made it alive again. But I want you to know, you don't have to face any of this alone." She turned, her eyes shimmering with tears. "You've already given me more than I ever dreamed. A roof over our heads, a future for my child, a reason to believe again." She paused, her lips trembling. "James, I don't know how to thank you." He stepped closer, his hat in his hand, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me. Just let me be here. For you. For him. For whatever comes next." The silence between them was thick yet gentle. Clara felt her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in a long time, trust, maybe even love. She reached out, her hand brushing his. It was a small gesture, but to both of them, it felt like a promise. The months that followed were filled with growth. The ranch flourished, the crops sprouted strong, and Clara's child thrived. Neighbors often visited, bringing gifts, trading goods, and sharing meals at the long wooden table James had built. Clara's laughter began to fill the air again, soft. Hesitant at first, but then freer, like the song of a bird set loose from a cage. James found himself smiling more often, too, his once lonely ranch now brimming with warmth and life. Yet one day the past came back to test them. Her late husband's family returned, bitter and angry that Clara had found a new life when they had cast her aside. They rode up to the ranch, their faces hard, demanding she hand over the land. James stepped forward, tall and unyielding, his voice like steel. "This land ain't yours to claim. It belongs to her. And if you've got a quarrel, you'll have to take it up with me." The family, seeing the determination in his eyes and the rifles of loyal neighbors standing nearby, realized they had lost. They rode away, leaving behind only dust and the echo of their defeat. Clara, trembling, looked at James. "You stood for me when no one else did." He only answered, "I'll always stand for you." That night, under the stars, Clara finally allowed herself to dream of tomorrow without fear. She rocked her child to sleep on the porch while James sat beside her, the crickets singing around them. She whispered softly, more to herself than to him, "This is home." James reached over, gently covering her hand with his. "Home," he echoed, and in that simple word was a vow that stretched beyond spoken promises. Beyond the horizon itself, as the seasons turned, Clara and James built a life together, not one born of obligation, but of choice, of respect, of quiet love that had been forged through trials. The ranch became a place of welcome, a refuge for the weary, a symbol of resilience. And every morning, when the sun rose golden across the prairie, Clara knew her husband's memory rested peacefully, not in sorrow, but in the legacy of hope. She carried forward that her journey from despair to belonging had ended not with loss, but with land love and the strength to begin again.